Mark tried to stay out of his way, but it wasn't long before Kevin zeroed in on him. "Mark, can we talk in my office?" Kevin's tone was saccharine, a fake cordiality that fooled no one. The employees nearby exchanged uneasy glances as Mark followed Kevin upstairs. Kevin's office was a stark contrast to the bustling warehouse below. Sleek furniture, framed motivational posters, and the faint scent of expensive cologne filled the space. Kevin leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. "I just wanted to touch base," Kevin began, folding his hands theatrically. "It seems like you've been struggling lately. Missing deadlines, shipments delayed." "Those were supplier issues," Mark interjected, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. Kevin raised an eyebrow. "And yet, they always seem to happen under your watch. Don't you think that reflects poorly on your leadership?" Mark bit his tongue. This was Kevin's game, twisting facts to suit his narrative, pushing people until they either broke down or quit. "I'm doing my best with the resources we have," Mark replied calmly. "If there's a specific area you think needs improvement, I'm open to feedback." Kevin's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. He thrived on confrontation, and Mark's measured response denied him the satisfaction. "Well," Kevin said, leaning forward, "your best might not be enough. We need results, Mark. Maybe it's time you reconsidered whether this role is the right fit for you." Mark felt the weight of Kevin's words, but he refused to let them crush him. Instead, he nodded. "I appreciate your feedback, Kevin. I'll make sure to review my processes." Kevin looked disappointed, perhaps expecting Mark to lash out or crumble. But Mark turned and walked out of the office, his head held high. As he descended the stairs, he felt a surge of determination. Kevin could bully, intimidate, and manipulate all he wanted, but Mark wasn't going to make it easy for him. Later that afternoon, while checking inventory logs, Mark noticed something odd. A discrepancy in the shipment records didn't add up. He cross-referenced the logs with supplier invoices and discovered a pattern. Several shipments had been marked as delivered but never actually arrived. At first, he thought it was an error, but the deeper he dug, the more suspicious it seemed. He decided to confide in Linda, a longtime colleague and one of the few people he trusted. They met in the break room after hours, away from prying eyes. Linda listened intently as Mark explained his findings, her brow furrowing. "This doesn't look like a mistake," she said. "It looks like someone's covering their tracks." Mark's stomach turned. If his suspicions were correct, this wasn't just about bullying, it was about something much bigger. And Kevin was right at the center of it. Mark nodded, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were printouts of the logs he had pieced together, highlighting the missing shipments and the corresponding invoices. Linda flipped through them, her expression growing darker with each page. "This isn't just mismanagement," she said. "This is fraud." "Exactly," Mark said. "And if we're right, it's not just about money. This could affect the entire company. Clients are being billed for goods they never received. If this gets out, it could ruin our reputation." Linda leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "So what's the plan? You're not thinking of confronting Kevin, are you?" "Not yet," Mark said. "But I can't just let this slide. I need to gather more evidence, something airtight. If I go to the board with this, I need them to have no choice but to act." Linda hesitated. "Mark, you know how dangerous this is, right? If Kevin finds out you're investigating him." "I know," Mark said quietly. "But I can't ignore this. Not anymore." Over the next week, Mark and Linda worked covertly, sifting through records, emails, and even security footage when they could access it. Every discovery painted a clearer picture of Kevin's scheme. He had been skimming off the top, diverting shipments to third parties who paid him under the table while the company footed the bill. The scale of the operation was staggering, and it was clear Kevin had been doing this long before he joined their company. But as they dug deeper, Mark began to notice something troubling. Kevin was growing suspicious. His behavior became more erratic, his temper flaring over minor issues. He started showing up unannounced in the warehouse, watching employees closely and questioning their activities. One afternoon, Mark caught Kevin staring at him from across the floor, his expression unreadable but intense. That night, Mark received an email from Kevin. The subject line read, "Performance Review Meeting, Tomorrow." Mark's stomach twisted as he read the message. It was a thinly veiled threat. Kevin was tightening the noose, trying to intimidate him into backing down. The next day, Mark walked into Kevin's office with his head held high, determined not to show any fear. Kevin gestured for him to sit, his smile as fake as ever. "Mark," Kevin began, his tone dripping with insincerity. "I've been reviewing your performance lately, and I have some concerns. It seems like your focus has been slipping. Is there something distracting you?" Mark met Kevin's gaze, his voice steady. "I've been doing my job to the best of my ability, Kevin. If you have specific concerns, I'd be happy to address them." Kevin's smile faltered, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He leaned forward, his tone shifting. "Let me be clear, Mark. I need my managers to be fully committed to this company. If you can't handle that, maybe it's time to reconsider your position here." As he neared the entrance, he spotted a lone security guard pacing by the gate. Mark waited until the guard stepped away to make a phone call, then slipped through a gap in the fence he'd noticed earlier. Inside, the facility was eerily quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. Rows of storage units stretched out before him, their metal doors locked tight. Mark moved quickly, guided by the unit numbers listed in the email. When he found the first unit, he crouched down and inspected the lock. It was a heavy-duty padlock, but years of working with machinery had taught Mark a thing or two about bypassing stubborn barriers. He pulled out a small tool kit he'd brought just in case and got to work. The lock clicked open, and Mark lifted the door just enough to peek inside. His heart raced as he saw the contents, pallets of merchandise bearing the company's logo. It was exactly what he'd suspected, the missing shipments, hidden in plain sight. He snapped photos with his phone, documenting every detail. As he moved to check another unit, he heard the faint crunch of gravel behind him. Mark froze, his pulse quickening. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. At first, he saw nothing, but then a shadow moved near the entrance. Someone was there, watching him. "Who's there?" a voice called out. It wasn't Kevin's voice, but it was firm and authoritative. Mark realized it was the security guard, probably making his rounds. Thinking quickly, Mark slipped behind a stack of boxes, holding his breath as the guard's flashlight swept the area. The beam lingered for a moment on the partially open unit, and Mark's stomach sank. If the guard investigated further, he'd find the open lock and the exposed pallets. The guard stepped closer, muttering something under his breath. Just as he reached for the door, the faint sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. The guard hesitated, then sighed and walked away, answering the call. Mark exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited until the guard's footsteps faded before slipping out of the facility the way he came. Back in his car, Mark sat for a moment, letting the adrenaline subside. He had what he needed, photographic proof of the stolen goods. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. Kevin's scheme was bigger than he'd imagined, and exposing it would require more than just evidence. It would require strategy. The next day, Mark and Linda met in her apartment, their makeshift war room. The photos Mark had taken confirmed their suspicions, but there was one piece of the puzzle they hadn't solved: how Kevin was laundering the profits. Linda had been digging through financial records, and she finally found the answer. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of transactions in the company's expense reports. These payments are listed as vendor fees, but the vendors don't exist. Kevin's been funneling the money through dummy. And it explains why he's been so ruthless, Linda added. If this gets out, he's done for. Mark leaned back, rubbing his temples. We need to bring this to the board, but we can't do it directly. Kevin has connections, and if he gets wind of this, he'll find a way to bury it. Linda nodded. What about going public? The media? Too risky, Mark said. We need to handle this internally first. If the board doesn't act, then we'll take it to the press. They spent the rest of the evening preparing a presentation for the board, compiling every piece of evidence into a concise, irrefutable case. As they worked, Mark couldn't help but think about the risks. If this failed, he wouldn't just lose his job, Kevin would destroy him. But as he looked at Linda, her determination matching his own, he knew they were doing the right thing. For the company, for the employees, and for everyone Kevin had hurt. That night, as Mark lay in bed, his mind raced with possibilities. He thought about Sophie, about the example he wanted to set for her. He thought about his co-workers, many of whom had endured Kevin's bullying in silence. And he thought about Kevin, the man who had built his career on the suffering of others. Tomorrow, everything would change. One way or another, Mark was ready to face whatever came next. The morning of the board meeting arrived with an eerie sense of calm. Mark woke up early, his nerves buzzing as he reviewed the presentation one last time. The evidence was meticulously organized, with screenshots of fraudulent invoices, emails between Kevin and his shady contacts, photos of the stolen goods in the storage facility, and a financial trail leading straight to Kevin's dummy accounts. He felt a mix of dread and resolve. This was the day everything would come to light. Linda met him outside the office just before the meeting. She was carrying a laptop and a folder, her face set in determination. You ready for this? She asked. As ready as I'll ever be, Mark replied, forcing a smile. You? I've been waiting for this moment for years, she said. Let's take him down. The boardroom was already bustling when they walked in. The members of the board sat around a polished oak table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. Kevin was there too, leaning back in his chair with a confident smirk. He gave Mark a cursory glance, but it was enough to send a clear message: I know what you're up to, and you won't win. Mark swallowed hard and took his seat. The meeting began with routine updates from department heads, and Kevin gave his usual polished report, spinning his numbers to make the company's performance seem better than it was. Mark listened quietly, his mind focused on the moment he and Linda would take the floor. When the time came, Mark stood up and walked to the front of the room. He connected his laptop to the projector and took a deep breath. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to discuss a matter of utmost importance regarding our operations and financial integrity. Kevin's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward in his chair as if curious. Mark began by outlining the missing shipments, showing the discrepancies in the records and explaining how he and Linda had traced them to a storage facility off-site. He displayed the photos of the stolen goods, then moved on to the fraudulent invoices and the dummy vendor accounts. As he spoke, the room grew quieter, the board members exchanging uneasy glances. This is where our missing assets have been going, Mark said, clicking to the next slide. It showed a flowchart detailing how Kevin had funneled money through the dummy accounts. These accounts are directly linked to Kevin's personal banking information. The room erupted in murmurs, and Kevin shot to his feet. This is outrageous, he exclaimed, his face red with anger. You're accusing me of fraud based on circumstantial evidence? This is a blatant attempt to undermine me. Mark didn't flinch. Everything I've presented is supported by hard evidence, he said calmly. Emails, financial records, security footage, it's all there. If you'd like to refute it, feel free to provide an explanation for the missing shipments and the dummy accounts." Kevin's eyes darted around the room, looking for allies among the board members. But the evidence was damning, and the murmurs of discontent told Mark that the tide was turning. One of the board members, an older man named Mr. Carlyle, cleared his throat. "This is a serious accusation, Mark. Are you absolutely certain of your findings?" "Yes, sir," Mark said. "I've spent weeks verifying every detail. And I didn't do it alone, Linda has been instrumental in uncovering this." Kevin sneered. "Oh, of course. You're colluding with a warehouse clerk to stage a coup. How very noble of you." Linda stood up, her voice steady and firm. "I may be a warehouse clerk, but I've worked here for over 20 years. I care about this company, and I won't stand by while someone like you tears it apart for personal gain." The boardroom fell silent again, and Mr. Carlyle nodded thoughtfully. "Kevin," he said, his tone sharp, "do you have any explanation for these discrepancies?" Kevin's face twisted in anger. "This is a witch hunt. These so-called discrepancies are minor errors blown out of proportion by someone who clearly has a grudge against me." But the board wasn't buying it. Mr. Carlyle turned to another member, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Loring. "We need to investigate this immediately," he said. "If what Mark and Linda have presented is true, it could have serious legal and financial implications for the company." Ms. Loring nodded. "Agreed. I'll contact our legal team and arrange for an independent audit. In the meantime, I suggest we place Kevin on administrative leave." Kevin's face turned pale. "You can't do this. I've been nothing but loyal to this company." "Enough," Mr. Carlyle said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The evidence speaks for itself. You'll have a chance to defend yourself during the investigation. Until then, consider yourself relieved of your duties." Kevin glared at Mark, his expression a mix of fury and desperation. "You'll regret this," he hissed before storming out of the room. As the door slammed behind him, Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The board members began discussing next steps, but their tone was no longer accusatory. Mark and Linda had done what they set out to do, they had exposed the truth. After the meeting, Linda pulled Mark aside. "You did it," she said, a smile breaking through her serious demeanor. "We did it." Mark nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's not over yet. The investigation could take weeks, and who knows what else Kevin might try. But at least the truth is out there." As they walked out of the building, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt a sense of hope. He had stood up for what was right, not just for himself but for everyone who had suffered under Kevin's leadership. And as he thought about Sophie, he knew he had set an example she could be proud of. The aftermath of the board meeting unfolded like a slow unraveling of a tightly wound spool. Kevin's suspension sent ripples through the company, leaving employees in a mix of shock, curiosity, and, for some, quiet relief. Whispers spread like wildfire in the hallways, with workers exchanging theories about what had really happened behind closed doors. Mark kept his head down, focusing on his work while quietly supporting the ongoing investigation. He knew this was a delicate time, though Kevin was no longer a direct threat, the fallout was far from over. The legal team moved quickly, and within days, external auditors arrived to pore over the company's financial records. Linda, with her encyclopedic knowledge of warehouse operations, became an invaluable resource for the auditors. She spent hours providing context for the missing shipments, explaining how Kevin's manipulations had slipped through the cracks for so long. Mark admired her unflinching dedication, even as the process dredged up painful memories of the bullying and disrespect she had endured under Kevin's regime. For Mark, life at the warehouse took on a surreal quality. He was no longer the quiet, hard-working manager in the shadows. Employees began approaching him with stories of their own, small acts of intimidation by Kevin, moments of doubt they had kept to themselves, and, most poignantly, their gratitude. "Thanks for standing up," one forklift driver told him during a break. "I didn't think anyone would ever have the guts to take him on." Mark nodded, humbled by their trust. But even as he felt the warmth of their support, he remained vigilant. Kevin might have been removed from the building, but Mark knew the man wasn't the type to go down without a fight. One evening, as Mark was locking up the warehouse, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. A low, familiar voice greeted him. "You think this is over, Mark?" It was Kevin. Mark's stomach churned, but he kept his tone steady. "If you're calling to intimidate me, Kevin, don't bother. The evidence speaks for itself." Kevin laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Evidence can be twisted, hidden, erased. You've made an enemy, Mark, and I don't forget things like this." The call ended abruptly, leaving Mark standing in the dimly lit parking lot, his heart pounding. He replayed the conversation in his mind, anger mixing with unease. Kevin's words weren't just a threat, they were a promise. And Mark knew he had to prepare for whatever came next. The next day, Mark shared the incident with Linda, who immediately urged him to report it to the legal team. Reluctantly, Mark agreed, providing them with a transcript of the call. The legal team took the threat seriously, filing a formal report and advising Mark to remain cautious. Security around the warehouse was tightened, and employees were instructed to report any unusual activity. As the investigation continued, the auditors uncovered even more evidence of Kevin's misdeeds. Beyond the missing shipments and dummy accounts, they found forged contracts, falsified performance reports, and even kickbacks from suppliers who had benefited from Kevin's schemes. The depth of the corruption was staggering, and the board was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth: Kevin's misconduct had been enabled by a culture of complacency. The board called an emergency meeting to address the findings, and Mark was invited to speak. It was a daunting prospect, but he knew this was his chance to push for meaningful change. As he stood before the board, he spoke not just about Kevin's actions but about the broader issues that had allowed them to occur. "This isn't just about one man's greed," Mark said. "It's about a system that ignored red flags and silenced those who tried to speak out. If we want to rebuild trust, both within the company and with our clients, we need to create a culture where accountability and transparency are the norm, not the exception." His words struck a chord. The board members nodded in agreement, and by the end of the meeting, they had committed to implementing new oversight measures, including stricter audits and an anonymous reporting system for employees. For Mark, the victory was bittersweet. He had achieved what he set out to do, but the cost had been high. His life had been turned upside down, and Kevin's threat still lingered in the back of his mind. Yet, as he left the boardroom, he felt a sense of closure. The company was on a path to recovery, and he had played a part in steering it away from disaster. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new normal. Kevin's crimes became a topic of local news, tarnishing his reputation and ensuring he would never again wield the kind of power he had abused so recklessly. Mark received a quiet promotion, not to a flashy title but to a role that allowed him to influence the company's culture in meaningful ways. He worked closely with Linda and other employees to ensure that their voices were heard, using his newfound position to advocate for fairness and integrity. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch with Sophie, she looked up at him with a thoughtful expression. "Dad, are you glad you did it? Standing up to that man?" Mark smiled, ruffling her hair. "It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always fun. But yeah, I'm glad. Sometimes, doing the right thing means taking risks. And even if it's scary, it's worth it in the end." Sophie nodded, her face brightening with pride. "You're like a superhero, but without the cape." Mark laughed, pulling her into a hug. "I think I'll stick to being your dad. That's a pretty good gig." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The fight had been long and grueling, but it had also been worth it. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had not only changed the company but also set an example for his daughter, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Months had passed since Kevin's removal, and the warehouse was thriving under its new leadership. The air in the building was lighter, the workers more engaged, and a sense of camaraderie that had long been missing was steadily returning. Mark had worked tirelessly alongside the new management to rebuild trust among employees, fostering an environment where their voices were not just heard but valued. Despite the progress, Kevin's shadow still loomed in unexpected ways. The investigation into his crimes had led to a lengthy legal battle. Kevin, predictably, denied all allegations, claiming he was the victim of a vendetta orchestrated by Mark and Linda. His legal team was aggressive, attempting to discredit the evidence and tarnish the reputations of those who had exposed him. But the mountain of documentation, emails, financial records, and witness statements, was irrefutable. The court proceedings became a media spectacle, with reporters regularly seeking out Mark for comments. Mark, however, avoided the limelight. He knew that public attention would only serve as a distraction, and his focus remained on his family and his work. Linda, too, shied away from interviews, preferring to let the facts speak for themselves. Still, they both felt the strain of the ongoing trial. Kevin's smear tactics were relentless, and the stress of constant scrutiny weighed heavily on them. One day, as Mark was reviewing new employee training protocols, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the company's legal team, marked urgent. His heart sank as he opened it, fearing more complications, but the contents brought a wave of relief. Kevin had finally agreed to a plea deal. He would plead guilty to multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement in exchange for a reduced sentence. The news spread quickly, bringing a sense of closure to the company. Employees celebrated quietly, grateful that the ordeal was finally nearing its end. For Mark, however, the victory felt bittersweet. Kevin's downfall was necessary, but it didn't erase the damage he had caused. The financial losses, the mistrust, and the emotional toll on employees were scars that would take time to heal. In the weeks following Kevin's conviction, the company took bold steps to ensure such corruption could never happen again. A whistleblower hotline was established, and an external ethics committee was formed to oversee company policies. Mark played a key role in these initiatives, drawing on his own experiences to create a system that empowered employees to speak out without fear of retaliation. Linda, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. She was promoted to a managerial position, where her decades of experience and unwavering integrity made her an ideal leader. Outside of work, Mark's personal life blossomed. Sophie had taken a keen interest in his story, often asking him questions about the decisions he had made and the lessons he had learned. Her curiosity inspired Mark to start writing about his experiences, not for publication but as a way to reflect and share his journey with her. He realized that his actions had shaped not just his own future but also the values Sophie would carry forward. One evening, Mark was invited to speak at a community event focused on workplace ethics and integrity. The auditorium was packed with people eager to hear his story, from business leaders to young professionals. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the expectant faces, he felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. He began by recounting the challenges he had faced, the bullying, the fear of retaliation, and the difficult decision to stand up against Kevin. "What I've learned," he said, his voice steady, "is that doing the right thing often comes with a cost. It's not easy to confront corruption or to challenge those in power. But if we stay silent, we become complicit. Integrity isn't just about following the rules, it's about having the courage to hold others accountable, even when it's uncomfortable or risky." The audience was rapt, and as Mark continued, he felt a sense of catharsis. He spoke about Linda's unwavering support, the strength he had found in his colleagues, and the lessons he hoped Sophie would carry with her. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. People lined up to thank him, sharing their own stories of workplace struggles and seeking his advice. As Mark drove home that night, the weight of the past year finally seemed to lift. He had not only exposed corruption but also inspired others to take a stand. The journey had been arduous, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but it had also been transformative. He realized that the real victory wasn't just in Kevin's downfall but in the changes it had sparked, in the company, in the community, and within himself. Back at home, Sophie was waiting for him on the couch, her eyes lighting up as he walked through the door. "How was the speech, Dad?" she asked. Mark sat down beside her, a smile spreading across his face. "It was good," he said. "Really good. But you know what? The best part of all this is coming home to you." Sophie grinned and hugged him tightly. "You're my hero, you know that." Mark chuckled, holding her close. "I'm just trying to do what's right, kiddo. And if that makes me your hero, then I guess I'm doing okay." As the night settled in, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, he had found a renewed sense of purpose and connection. His story wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about resilience, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. And as he looked at Sophie, he knew that the future, for both of them, was brighter than ever.